You have families who, because of all the propaganda, are believing that to have a child with negative traits is a bad thing. It's bad for the health of Germany.
They were killing children with disabilities, children with Down syndrome, children with cardiac anomalies, children with cerebral palsy, children who didn't develop normally, who were considered to be useless feeders. That was the term used.
Public health nurses would go to the families, promise them, if you will give your child to us, your child will get the best care. And so people were falsely led to believe that and relinquish their children. The nurses were involved in the killing of children by giving them overdoses, by taking them outside knowing that it was going to contribute to their death.
I got very interested in this when I found out that nurses actively killed their patients. And I became intrigued into how they could come to believe that killing was a legitimate part of their caring role, which they did. The propaganda around the whole idea of killing people for the good of the state was profound, even down to children doing exercises in their school books on how much it costs to keep people with a disability, for example.
Midwives and physicians were mandated by German law to report any infant born with a birth defect, and the infant would be placed in an institution. Midwives were paid for each birth that they reported.
Midwives were licensed. They had to go through a similar training period as nursing, and many of them were independent practitioners. So not long after the child was put into a home, he or she would then be moved to another institution further away. Of course, there was no consent, no nothing. These killings were done without the parents' approval, more or less, in the main.
The nurses and the midwives who were involved in the carrying out, maybe not even the ideology, but were actually the doers of the euthanasia program. Euthanasia is really a euphemism for murder because these were not terminally ill patients. These were children that were taken and murdered, mostly children who had handicap or mental retardation.
I think one deciding point is in Germany, the notion that the health of the public is more important than the health of the individual. So consequently, to remove an unhealthy element was seen as good.
In September 1939, a decision was made to develop an adult euthanasia program for patients in psychiatric facilities. Hitler picked the date to coincide with Germany's invasion of Poland.
To expand it to include adults, the only way we're going to make this acceptable is to say we need these hospital beds for the war wounded. Why should the state pay to keep totally disabled people alive when our young guys are sent to the front, need to come back home and have care?
The name of this killing organization was T4. Eventually, 6 killing centers were established. Medical staffs were ordered to fill out questionnaires to evaluate whether their patients should live or die. Patients were placed in gas chambers that looked like showers. Then lethal carbon monoxide was pumped into the chambers, killing the patients.
You have to justify and rationalize what you're doing because you're doing it. But they actually believed it. And they actually believed that what they were doing was saving the folk from its contamination, from the infection, that there was a disease. And the disease was the handicapped and the infirmed, and that they needed to be cured through killing, healing through killing.
They were told they were being transferred. The nurses packed their clothes, their lunch, rode with them on the buses. The hospitals, these 6, had specially constructed kind of breezeways that the buses would go through so the patients could be unloaded into the hospital without being viewed by the community.
However, it didn't take long for the communities near these hospitals to realize what was going on.
People would see the buses. The buses were very unique, painted gray, the windows were painted over and so forth. The buses would arrive, and within a very short period of time, this acrid smoke would be billowing out of the chimneys. Each hospital had a department to write condolence letters to the families. And there were mix-ups. They would write and say, "We're sorry to tell you your uncle, Hans, died of appendicitis." And maybe he'd already had his appendix removed. People were becoming quite knowledgeable about what was going on. Even children would taunt other children, saying they're going to put you on the gray bus. You're going to go up the chimney.
As knowledge of the gassing of patients became widespread, the decision was made to end the T4 euthanasia program in August 1941. This, however, did not end the killing of patients. The children's euthanasia program continued unabated until the end of the war. After the end of the T4 program, physicians were granted permission to provide a merciful death to any person they deemed to be suffering. These killings, which took place at many hospitals throughout the Third Reich, were known as wild euthanasia or decentralized euthanasia, and were carried out on an individual basis rather than by gassing. Patients, usually selected by physicians but killed by nurses, were administered overdoses of sedatives. More people died in wild euthanasia than in T4. Why did the nurses follow orders to kill?
We do know that the doctors were the ones who signed the certificates that said whether the child was to live or die. It was the nurses who carried out the killings. The doctors didn't necessarily carry out the killings themselves. They may have dictated who was to die, but it was the nurses who carried out the killings. There are episodes where the nurses decided themselves to take things into their own hands and kill the patients because they knew they were going to die anyway, so he was suffering, so I'll do it now. He's going to die anyway, so I might as well do it quicker.
There's the most mesmerizing quote from one of the nurses who talks about how lovingly we held them in our arms while we got them to drink this medication. We didn't want them to suffer more than necessary while they were killing.
More than 70 years later, the question of how Germany's nurses became involved in these killings still intrigues historians.
Well, it is, of course, a multifaceted phenomenon, I think, what happened there. But it is a very good example of you start one thing and then it leads to something a little worse and a little worse. So at first, if they were asked to hold a patient while somebody else did something, an injection or whatever, they could do that, and they could say to themselves, I'm not the one taking any action here. And then from there, it's a shorter step to, well, you give the injection.
For some nurses, I can see that they could easily fall into the trap of thinking that this was the right thing to do. To me, though, the whole issue is interesting because there's a line that, as a nurse, that you cross.
And I think also in that era, nurses were very subservient and very obedient, and whatever the doctor said they should do, they felt they had to obey and do that or fear the consequences.
And similar to their obedience to physicians, nurses were also educated to be obedient to senior nurses, who at times also ordered killings.
Nurses were involved in actually the killings themselves, either through active means or through passive means, letting patients starve or exposing them to hazards where they would get pneumonia and other things and die.
In 1939, World War II began when the Germans attacked and invaded neighboring Poland.
Our building was actually also hit.
Polish survivor Anna Steinberger recalls the bombing.
And I could see the flames on the roof of the building. I asked my mom, what is going on? Do I go to school? And she says, no school today. Just go hide in the cellar.
Polish Jews were rounded up into ghettos and later moved to other institutions for medical experiments. A decision was made by the Nazis in January of 1942 at the Wannsee Conference to go further with the final solution and move the Jews into death camps.
So there were 4 camps that were specifically created as death camps. Belzec, Kelmo, Treblinka, and Sobibor. There were 2 additional concentration camps that developed a killing portion. That would be Majdanek and Auschwitz.
Some skilled workers were kept alive to work in the camps.
And the infrastructure and the know-how and the personnel of the 64 centers was actually transferred to Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and they have built the first gas chambers.
And then some of the same doctors and nurses who were involved in the euthanasia program took the gas chambers down and reassembled them in the Poland at the concentration camps, where doctors selected at the ramps and were involved in supervising the gassings and killings. So physicians were involved in all aspects.
Ravensbrück, located in Germany, was a camp for women.
Most of the women were Polish. There were some Jews there, but most of the women were dissenters or women who'd caused trouble to the Nazis when the Nazis occupied Poland.
Ravensbrück was located close to one of the largest and most important hospitals in Germany, where a lot of research was going on.
Reinhard Heydrich was the Nazi protector of Czechoslovakia, who in 1942 was killed by a bomb. He died from infection of the wounds that he got. He died several days later.
Hitler demanded that doctors should find a cure for these deadly infections.
And so Ravensbrück, which was close by, had all these women there that they used as lab rats, basically. The women were operated on by the surgeons from this hospital. They had things like wounds created in their legs that were filled up with sawdust, dirt, ground glass, to see what would happen to the wound, how wounds developed, how bone became infected. Some of these women were sent to the gas chambers afterwards. They were killed. Some of the women died, of course, from the experiments, and some of the women survived to give testimony in the trials. But nurses were definitely involved in those experiments.
Many German physicians and nurses participated in medical experiments related to racial hygiene in the concentration camps and hospitals. One of the worst was Dr. Joseph Mengele, a member of the SS.
Then the cattle car doors opened and we stepped down onto a little strip of land called the selection platform. We had no idea where we were. All we really knew that we did not arrive in Hungary, but we were taken